Hello, friends. Today is Saturday, the very weekend when negotiations are taking place in Miami, Florida. A Ukrainian delegation is present there, and the Russian delegation is already joining the talks. There are representatives from Europe as well, and even Donald Trump is expected to fly in. However, Zelensky will not be there, a very notable detail. Meanwhile, Zelensky responded to Putin's statements regarding elections in Ukraine. He commented on Putin's so-called direct line. Budanov has also spoken about whether he intends to run in elections. I draw your attention to this, friends. Alongside the negotiation process, discussions about elections in Ukraine have intensified. And not only that, the Russians once again struck the port infrastructure of the Odesa region. There are many killed and wounded. Why this particular region is being targeted, I am ready to explain as well. So please subscribe, comment, and share this video with friends and acquaintances. I also ask you to join the next fundraising effort for the 66th Brigade. We have some unpleasant news. 2 Starlinks, one of which had been on the front line for 3 years, have been destroyed. Unfortunately, war spares no one. We have losses. Therefore, I ask you to join the fundraiser. We are currently raising funds for a new Starlink, with the goal of purchasing 1 unit. We will not cover the subscription fee. The soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine will take that on themselves. We also need spare parts for vehicles. These are traditional expenses. Tires. And we also need consumables for the unit of unmanned systems operators. Once again, friends, the fundraising target is 100,000 hryvnias. You can find the link in the description under this video. As usual, all reports are available on my Telegram channel. You can subscribe there and track the spending. The Telegram link is also in the video description. And now, friends, let's go into a bit more detail about the negotiations and more. In the United States, the first meeting concluded today, by first, I mean today, between Marov and Hnatov and the American representatives Witkoff and Kushner. Marov did not provide many details. He wrote about it on his Telegram channel and also reported that he briefed the president of Ukraine on the results of the talks. Trump also announced that he is flying to Florida and will likely be present at the negotiations, although he did not specify this directly. Putin's representative, Kirill Dmitriev, has already arrived there. He published a corresponding photo on X and said he would be communicating with the Americans. Meanwhile, Reuters writes that trilateral contacts in Miami should not be expected. Journalists hint, citing anonymous sources, that Russia and Ukraine will not be sitting at the same table with the Americans. But I think this is a preemptive move. It's clear that contacts will take place, but for political reasons they will not be announced now. U.S. Secretary of State Rubio also commented on the course of the negotiations, although he speaks very little about this process. He said, "We hope the war can be settled by the end of this year." Meanwhile, Matt Whitaker, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, says the war may end in 2026. In any case, one must prepare for war, and one must always be prepared for war. But the intensity with which Trump is pushing, let's put it this way, the negotiation process today is obvious. By the way, we discussed this in detail today on the channel with Ole Penson. He suggested why exactly Europeans voted the way they did on financial assistance to Ukraine. Friends, it was a very interesting conversation. I recommend watching it. We'll leave the link in the top right corner. Go and watch it. Penson's version is very interesting and deserves attention. Meanwhile, commenting on the possibility of elections in Ukraine, because against the backdrop of negotiations, this topic is being raised louder and louder, by the American side, and not only, the issue was even raised by Putin yesterday during his direct line. President Zelensky stated that he has no intention of clinging to power. He said this in an interview with PAP, noting, "My reaction to signals from the United States was very open. I said that I have no intention, under any circumstances, of holding on to the chair. Of course, if there is an opportunity to hold proper, dignified, and democratic elections. If that opportunity does not exist now, it will appear literally within a few hours." Ihor explains the details there. What exactly the draft law prepared in the office of the President of Ukraine looks like for holding presidential elections, and who prepared it. You will learn many interesting details. So, friends, preparations for elections in Ukraine are indeed underway. Whether they will actually take place is another question. But in any case, signals are being sent to the United States today that if the war in Ukraine is frozen, presidential elections in Ukraine, at least discussions about them, will take place very quickly. Even the Poles have offered to help us conduct elections. This was reported by the Marshal of the Polish Sejm, who said it concerns legal and logistical assistance, not just sending observers. With observers, everything will be quite complicated. Europeans need a lot of time to prepare them to be deployed to Ukraine as observers. Training is needed, and so on. Here, things are done much faster. We know how to work far more quickly than Europeans, and that's a fact. Budanov, one of the potential candidates for the presidency of Ukraine, also commented on the possibility of his participation in the election campaign. But he spoke not only about that. He said Russia is rich in natural resources but lacks technological solutions to extract them. He also noted that Russia was supposed to be ready to launch direct aggression against Europe by 2030, but now the Russians have revised their plans to 2027. That's why we often see plans laid out for only 2 years. Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, previously spoke about 3 years, but now even funding is being allocated for 2. Of course, this leads to thoughts that Ukraine is being prepared to fight for another 2 years, but that is not the case. In any event, Ukraine needs money, whether in peacetime or wartime. Budanov also says Russia plans to occupy the Baltic states, but does not plan to occupy Poland, for example. Now, friends, about financing, because this is an important point. I briefly touched on the so-called reparations loan. The funds allocated by Europe amount to approximately $105 billion, since earlier it was about $90 billion. These funds are intended to help Ukraine over the next 2 years. This is an interest-free loan that we will have to repay in any case. The repayment terms have not yet been defined, but there is a preliminary political decision that we will repay this loan when we receive money from Russia in the form of reparations. That's why I call it a reparations loan. How this will be formally structured in an agreement and with whom? I can't say yet because the document does not exist. But in any case, Europe will finance us, though who exactly is still unknown. I think there will be more than one financial institution involved. Nevertheless, let's get more specific about the money because details are beginning to emerge. It depends on who will guarantee the financial backing of this loan and who opposed the confiscation of frozen Russian assets. And it turns out it's not only Italy, Hungary, and Slovakia, as we were previously told, but even Bulgaria and the Czech Republic. The circle of these countries is much wider. France has joined this list, and even the UK. The United Kingdom has refused to expropriate Russian assets. Financial Times reports that the British government abandoned the idea of using about $8 billion, more than $10 billion, of frozen Russian assets in British banks, mostly private ones, to help Ukraine, after a similar EU initiative failed on Friday morning. In other words, they waited for the issue to fail and then said they didn't want to do it either. Officials emphasize that London will not act alone and is ready to discuss the use of assets only jointly with Australia, Canada, and the European Union. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer's national security advisor is currently in Miami. Effectively, friends, the United States has done very interesting work with Europe today to ensure that Russian money immobilized in European banks remains untouched. One thing is to freeze assets, another is to confiscate them. Now, friends, a bit more detail about the shelling of Ukraine and Russia. Last night, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces struck a Russian patrol ship of Project 2-6 Okhotnik. An intriguing announcement was made yesterday evening by the Special Services. Today, the General Staff reports that the ship was patrolling the Caspian Sea near an oil and gas production platform. Several Ukrainian drones hit the ship. The extent of the damage is being clarified. A drilling platform at the Filanovsky oil and gas field in the Caspian Sea was also hit. Yes, friends, this is not the first time. Probably the fourth. The facility belongs to Lukoil. In addition, in the Krasnoselsky area of temporarily occupied Crimea, a radar system used to regulate aircraft movement and enable precise landings in poor visibility was struck. I draw your attention to the strikes on Russia's Shadow Fleet and on Lukoil platforms. These are not the first such attacks. I previously voiced Putin's reaction to this. He said that if strikes continue against Russia's Shadow Fleet, they will strike Odesa and its port infrastructure. This is a preliminary answer to the question of why the Russians are so massively shelling the Odesa region. At night, drones also attacked the Russian city of Novozhivkov in the Bryansk region. A strike likely occurred at a weapons storage site. Ammunition detonation has been recorded. Ukraine's air defense forces destroyed 31 out of 51 launched drones. Russia also fired 3 Iskander-M missiles at Ukraine, according to Ukraine's air defense forces. Overnight, the enemy also struck energy infrastructure in the Mykolaiv region. Power outages were recorded in the Voznesensk, Bashtanka, and Mykolaiv districts. In Mykolaiv, garages were damaged, according to rescuers and the regional administration. There were no casualties there, but sadly there are 8 dead and 27 wounded in the Odesa region. The Russians struck port infrastructure. These are the consequences of Putin's statements that if strikes hit the Shadow Fleet and Lukoil, then Ukrainian infrastructure will be targeted. As a result, our infrastructure may no longer be able to serve Ukraine's agricultural sector, and not only other major trade operations conducted through the Black Sea region. Of course, certain measures will be taken to ensure exports, but this will become increasingly difficult. For example, ground transport between Odesa and Chisinau is now effectively halted. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government is urgently eliminating the consequences of the Russian strike on the main bridge connecting Odesa and Izmail. This was reported by Ukraine's Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko. The U.S. Department of Justice has released part of the scandalous documents related to the case of the convicted sex offender and financier, Jeffrey Epstein. I'll give you some background on this story. Recall that Donald Trump himself agreed to sign the relevant bill passed by Congress. So what does it mean? Did Trump decide to release provocative materials against himself? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. So what is the essence of this very interesting story? It is noted that among thousands of released materials are photographs, phone call recordings, grand jury testimony, and interrogation transcripts. Among the files are photographs, attention now, with Bill Clinton and Michael Jackson. A painting depicting Clinton in a woman's dress attracted particular attention online. However, the publication is already being criticized for incomplete disclosure. Many photos are obscured with gray backgrounds and many faces are blurred. Democrats in Congress are frankly outraged, saying this is not what they wanted to see. But it must be understood that some people place great hopes on the Epstein story, believing it will lead to Trump's resignation. That is unlikely. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced the start of Operation Hawk Strike in Syria to eliminate ISIS militants, their infrastructure, and weapons positions. As the U.S. defense chief explained, this is retaliation for the killing of 2 American soldiers by an ISIS militant in Syria on December 13th. A translator was also killed that day. He said this is not the start of a war, it is the announcement of revenge. Overall, U.S. forces are striking dozens of ISIS locations across Syria. The Syrian authorities, Trump says, support this military operation. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff have presented potential investors with a plan to reconstruct the Gaza Strip, under which it would become a futuristic resort megacity. The United States would finance about 20% of certain costs, though not all. The Wall Street Journal reports this. In my view, this indicates Trump's intention to pursue a massive project to rebuild Gaza. Of course, fighting is still ongoing there and remains as intense as before, and experts doubt Hamas would agree to this. Still, I would not rush to definitive conclusions. Trump's persistence is indeed noteworthy. Not admirable, but noteworthy and worth watching. Will Trump succeed? We'll see. Likewise, we'll see how successful Donald Trump's initiative to end the war in Ukraine by the new year will be. I'm following all of this, friends, and I suggest we do it together. To that end, subscribe to the channel. Much love to you all, deep respect for each of you. Stay tuned.